Alright guys, so welcome back to the Revelation Bible Study. Argle Smith. If you haven't watched the first video, it's important that you watch these videos in order because in the Revelation study, the study builds upon itself. And so it's really important that you guys watch these videos in order. So go back and just watch video 1. This is video 2. Last time we talked a little bit about the author who wrote Revelation, which is the Apostle John, and we talked about the internal evidence and some of the external evidence that supports the authorship of John. And now, one of the things I want to talk about is the use of Old Testament words. The use of the Old Testament and some of the prominent words that is used a lot in the book of Revelation. So John wrote Revelation in an ancient form of Greek called Koine Greek. It's not a form of Greek that's spoken still today, but it was the universal language at one time, kind of like English is the universal language today in our time. There was a time when the world spoke Greek as their universal language. And so from this, Revelation contains about 916 or so Koine Greek words, and what's interesting is that almost half of them are used in the Gospel according to John, which is another evidence that supports that John, the Apostle John, is the author of Revelation. So that means that half of Revelation uses the same word usage as the Gospel according to John. And so if you look at some of the other words that are used in the other New Testaments, Revelation only contains 98 words that is used in the other letters of the New Testament. That's significant. So John, the Apostle John, uses half of them, whereas only 98 are used in some of the other letters. So that is a big evidence for that the Apostle John and not some other John wrote the book of Revelation. 108 of those words, of the 900 words or so, is only used in Revelation alone, and is not found in any of the other New Testament writings. So, and sometimes in order to find out what was important to the author, we have to figure out what words he repeated quite often in order to know what was important to him. So what kind of words do you think of when you think of Revelation? Some people think of big apocalyptic end of the world type words like explosion or fire or whatever, but some of the most important words that John used repeatedly have to do with the kingdom of God. And so the word throne is used like 44 times in Revelation. Words like king or kingdom or rule are used 37 times. Authority and power 40 times. To see or to hear or to perceive, those type of words, because this is a revelation, there's a lot of visions. Those words are used like 150 times in Revelation. What's also very interesting about the book of Revelation is that there are about 550 Old Testament passages being referenced from some of the prophets and some of the Torah in Revelation. That's significant. I mean, Revelation quotes the Old Testament so much that almost 1 out of every 4 verses in Revelation is a reference to the Old Testament. So the next thing I want to talk about is the title, Revelation or Apocalypse. A lot of people don't even understand what those words mean. So this book was given the title Revelation or Apocalypse. So if depending on your translation that you use, it might say Revelation or it might say Apocalypse. Revelation comes from the Latin title, and so and Apocalypse comes from the Greek title. Both words, Revelation and Apocalypse, they mean the same thing. It's like to reveal or uncover. And so it's like if you had something hidden under a blanket and somebody took that blanket off and revealed it to you, and then it wasn't hidden anymore. That is the definition of Revelation or apocalypse. It's the same word. So then the next thing I want to talk about is the style. Revelation has 4 styles blended together. And so first, Revelation is a letter, then it is a prophecy, it is apocalyptic, and it is a judgment. Revelation mixes Old Testament prophecy with apocalyptic style of writing. And so Old Testament prophecy focused on certain future events, while apocalyptic writing focuses on end of the world type of events. So prophecy can be any futuristic prophecy can be any kind of future event, but apocalyptic prophecy talks about the end of the world type events. Apocalyptic writing was a style of writing that developed out of the Old Testament prophets. And so a lot of ways John is kind of like mimicking some of these Old Testament prophets in this letter. Now remember that Revelation is a letter written to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Asia Minor is that part of the world which is now Western Turkey today. So chapters 2 and 3 opens with oracle letters written 1 letter each to each of the churches of the 7 churches in Asia Minor. My definition that I give for oracle, which I'm going to have you try to remember, is that an oracle is a prophetic sermon from God, and in this case, these are prophetic sermons from the Lord. Each of these letters were dictated to John by Jesus Christ in a vision through an angel. The prophecies predict literal events. Now, this is something that gets very confusing when people try to study Revelation. The prophecy itself is predicting future events, literal events, but they're doing it rather symbolically. And so that's where the confusion comes from in Revelation, because sometimes people try to interpret it literally when they should be interpreting it symbolically. Because some things in Revelations do have a literal interpretation, and other things are symbolic. And people when they get those confused, they start getting the whole book confused. So Revelation is also a book of judgment on Satan and his world system. So Satan in Revelation, we see this world system coming to in contrast with the reign of God, and so the reign of God and the reign of Satan are going to be coming to a final confrontation in Revelation. So that's one of the main themes of Revelation. Now, when I say letter, if you ever hear somebody call it epistle, an epistle is just on a letter. So moving on to structure, just like John opened his gospel account with a prologue and ends it with an epilogue, so too in the book of Revelation, John begins with a prologue and ends with an epilogue. So, in my opinion, this helps us prove that this is the same John. It's his same writing style. He's using the same structure. John relies heavily on the number 7 in this work. Number 7 is a symbolic number, and we'll discuss numbers and their symbols and their meanings later on in a lot more detail later. However, sandwiched in between the prologue and the epilogue, interestingly, I don't know if this really has anything to do with anything, but there are 7 sections. So Revelation begins with the prologue, which is chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And then part 1 are the letters to the 7 churches that goes from the chapter 1 to the end of chapter 3. And then part 2 is the 7 seals, chapters 4 and 6. And then part 3 are the 7 trumpets, which encompasses chapters 7 through 9. Part 4 is what some people call the darkest hour of world history. It's from chapters 10 through chapters 13. Part 5 are the 7 vials, or 7 bowls of wrath, which is chapters 14 through chapter 16. And in part 6 is Babylon and Armageddon, chapters 17 through chapters 19. And then finally, part 7 is the millennium, the last judgment, the New Jerusalem, and the rest of eternity. That is chapter 21 through 22:5. And then John ends with his epilogue, which is chapter 22, 6 through 21. That is the structure. If you need to go back and write that down, it's not going to be that important. We'll go through it as we get there. There are 5 traditional schemes of interpretation for John, and that's what I want to talk about next. The 5 traditional schemes of interpretation. Actually, there are 4, but I added a 5th one. Let me just preface this by saying there are about as many interpretations of Revelation as there are churches, but I'm just going to try to hit on the big ones. There are a few basic ones that I want you to be familiar with. The first one is called the historicist scheme of interpretation. The historicist scheme of interpretation. So according to the historicist scheme of interpretation, Revelation predicts a gradual unfolding of events through history and from the resurrection until the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so people from the historicist scheme try to look at different events throughout history, like World War II and the fall of the Roman Empire and different events throughout history, and they try to point to those events and they try to point into some section of Revelation as that being a fulfillment of Revelation. So John's visions in Revelation corresponds with certain events in history, basically. This view leads to the most contradictions and divisions within this scheme of interpretation. And the reason why is because no one can agree in this scheme of interpretation. No one can agree which event matches the vision in Revelation. So it's really relative. So some people argue, oh, this is chapter 6 or whatever, but they can't agree. This view of interpretation becomes arbitrary after a while, and it lacks evidence, facts and evidence. The second scheme of interpretation is called the spiritualist scheme of interpretation. Some people call this the idealist scheme of interpretation. So the spiritual scheme of interpretation or the idealist scheme of interpretation. So in this scheme of interpretation, Revelation reflects spiritual principles throughout history. And so according to this scheme, Revelation does not point to past or future events, but Revelation points to main principles being taught by God that are repeated over time, like history repeats itself. So one of the main principles that is being taught in Revelation according to this scheme of interpretation is that eventually good will overcome evil. In the end, God's kingdom will reign on the new earth forever and ever. And so that's one of the themes of the spiritualist schemes of interpretation. However, in my opinion, this is the weakest scheme of interpretation, because Revelation claims that it is primarily a book of prophecy. If you look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, Revelation claims that it is primarily a book of prophecy and not a book of spiritual principles to apply to our life. The third scheme of interpretation is called the preterist, which means gone by. The preterist scheme of interpretation. So Revelation, according to the preterist scheme of interpretation, believes that all of the events in Revelation have already been fulfilled, and that were fulfilled around the time of John's day. And so, in my opinion, so when you read Revelation, everything in Revelation is in the past. So in my opinion, this is also a very weak scheme of interpretation. First of all, because it denies, as Revelation claims to be, that Revelation is primarily a book of prophecy. While it is true that some of the events point to John's day, that's undeniable. The messages to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, that cannot be doubted. There is no doubt that Revelation points to the fulfillment of certain future events, and some of those events have not taken place yet. That also cannot be denied. And so finally, there is what is called the futurist scheme of interpretation. Some people call this the dispensational scheme of interpretation, but I am not a dispensationalist, and I will not be teaching on dispensationalism on this Bible study. So if you want to know what that is, you're going to have to go look that up. But there are people who hold to the futurist scheme of interpretation who are not dispensationalists. And so they believe that Revelation addresses the end of time, primarily. For the most part, Revelation points to some future events like the apocalypse, or the second coming of Christ, the final conflict with Christ and Satan, the millennium, the final judgment. Irenaeus, who was, just a couple generations from the Apostle John, he was a futurist. He was an ardent futurist in his view. In fact, the futurist scheme of interpretation held the primary view for the first 350 years of the church. The strong futurists take this view too far, though. You can take any view too far. There is no denying that some of these events have already passed. And so they interpret the whole book as being future, including the reestablishment of the 7 churches in Asia Minor, which I feel like is just taking that scheme too far. And then the 5th scheme, which I call the Argle scheme of interpretation, or the all of the above scheme of interpretation. So any combination of the above 4 interpretations mixed together. And this is kind of the approach I'm going to take with Revelation. And the reason why is because I do agree mainly with the futurist scheme of interpretation, but I cannot deny that the following is also true. So I can't deny that some of the events in Revelation are now in the past. So that would be in line with the preterist and the historist scheme of interpretation. I can't deny that. Revelation teaches us spiritual principles. I cannot deny that, and so that is in line with the spiritual scheme of interpretation. And then some of the events reflect John's day. That is the preterist scheme of interpretation. Therefore, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the phrase goes. So many times biblical prophecies will have 2 or more fulfillments. I know some of this may be new for you guys, but sometimes prophecy is not just fulfilled once in history. Sometimes prophecy is fulfilled more than once. And so, for example, many times in the Old Testament prophetic books, we see a prophet foretelling a near future event that also describes an event that's going to happen at the end of days, at the end of time. So some really bad interpreters of prophecy try to interpret John like today's newspaper headlines, but that is a really bad way of interpreting the book of Revelation, and we're not going to do that in our study. So now I want to talk a little bit about problems with interpretation. So the author is dead. I'm sorry, John died a long time ago, and we just can't dig him up from the grave and ask him questions. So anytime we have problems trying to understand Revelation, it's not like we can go to John and say, "Hey, John, what did you mean? I don't understand." And the other problem is that his whole audience is dead. There's nobody alive from the 7 churches, so we can't go ask them either. So another problem we have is that the original was written in that ancient Koine Greek language, which makes us rely on today's modern translations. And translations from one language to another aren't always perfect. Translation is an art and a science. John uses Greek words and Hebrew figures of speech that are foreign to us today. And regardless of how we interpret Revelation today, we must realize that it was written in a way that the original 7 churches of Asia Minor would have understood. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if they would not have understand John's letter through our interpretation, then we have the wrong interpretation. The interpretation of the letter can only be what the audience understood it to be in their situation in life and in John's situation in life. So Revelation also uses symbolism that was familiar to the first century church. And so some of those symbols are foreign to us. We don't know what they mean. Like a lot of the numbers that symbolize things in Revelation, like 3.5, we have no idea what 3.5 means today. What if I said, what does 3.5 represent? A lot of people wouldn't know the answer to that, but like 3.5 means judgment. It represents God's judgment. And so we're going to have to learn all what these things mean. And so another thing that is a problem is that John is seeing visions. Okay, and so people have a struggle with this a lot. And the majestic sights of the end of the world would have been rather difficult to describe for someone living in the first century, or even for someone living in our time today. Visions are hard to describe because they're symbolic. We can't always describe what we're seeing. John had that same problem. Sometimes it was too hard for him to describe what he was seeing. One of the main problems that plagues biblical scholars is that Revelation is not in chronological order. And so this is a huge mistake that people make when they study Revelation, is they, as they're reading it from start to finish, they think that it is in chronological order. That, that's how we write today, but it wasn't written in chronological order. So what order was it written in? The order that it was written in was according to the visions. So John had a vision, and then he has another vision, and then he has another vision. And that's the order at which he records his visions, not in chronological. And some of those visions are out of order. So we have to decipher that. So what order do we put it in? So this is called logical order instead of chronological order. So John wrote according to his visions. That's the logical order. And John is reporting each new vision as he sees it, and each time he says something along the lines of, then I saw, or then I heard. And every time he says this, we know that he is getting a new download from an angel at that time, a new vision. I like to call them downloads, spiritual downloads. So each new vision is not necessarily in chronological order. So let me talk about the situation. Those were the problems with interpretation. Let me talk about the situation. So the Roman Emperor Domitian was in power during this time period, and there was an imperial worship going on in Asia Minor. It was very popular. Imperial worship means worshiping the emperor. And so they had temples for the emperor, and you would go there and you would offer sacrifices, and you would honor the emperor by worshiping him as a god. So Domitian persecuted and martyred Christians all across the empire, not empire-wide, but sporadically, in some places more intensified, especially in Asia Minor, because the people were refusing to worship the emperor. In Asia Minor, the Christians were being thrown out of their Jewish synagogues. So these Christians, mostly in this time period, were still majority Jews. There were now, because of Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, there were several Gentiles in the church, but the majority of the church was still Jews. And so the Jews during this time, there was a diaspora, which means that the Jews were scattered all over the Roman Empire. And because they were scattered all over the Roman Empire, all these Jewish synagogues started springing up everywhere. And the Christians, they did not consider themselves non-Jews anymore. They didn't consider that they were starting a new religion. The Christians in this time period still considered themselves a Jewish sect. And so they were still culturally Jewish. They still had Jewish families, and they were still had a Jewish heritage. And so to be kicked out of their synagogue was a big deal because they felt betrayed by their own people, the Jews. John wrote a lot of politically driven messages in his letter, and if that letter got into the hands of the wrong people, that could cause a lot of persecution for these Christians. So there is that as well. And then the first century church would have seen judgment proclaimed over the Roman Empire in Revelation. And that is one of the interpretations of Revelation, that it is proclaiming judgment over the Roman Empire. But I am going to be arguing in this study that not only is it proclaiming judgment over the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire becomes a symbol for a much greater empire, the empire of Satan, and how God is going to proclaim judgment over Satan and his kingdom. So those are some of the problems with interpreting Revelation. Let me talk about some of the themes. So the church unified with heaven in Europe, in worship. So one day, there is going to be one church, and Jesus prayed in John 17 that the church would be one, just as him and the Father are one. But today the church is divided, it's broken, it's shattered, it's in pieces, it's tattered. But one day, God's church is going to be united together. It's going to be one church made up of all nations in the world. It's not just going to be a Jewish church. It's going to be a church made up of all of God's people. And so in Revelation, we see one world ideas. And a lot of these one world ideas are one world ideas of Antichrist and of Satan. And so there are one world political ideas, Satan and his powers establishing a one world government, one world economy. Why is because in the end times, the world system of Satan is going to come against the system of the kingdom. And we're going to see that final confrontation coming to a head in the book of Revelation. We also see the antagonism of the world towards a church obedient to God. And so in the end times, unfortunately, we are going to see a lot of persecution and a lot of martyrdom. And some people call the book of Revelation a manual of martyrdom or handbook for martyrs, because in the book of Revelation, we're going to see a lot of God's people being persecuted and martyred. And so that is another theme. Christians must be willing to face death in order to honor Christ. That is one of the big themes in the book of Revelation. The hope of Christ's return is our driving force. We're not driven by worldly pleasures. We are driven by the hope of our resurrection. And so that is one of the big themes in the book of Revelation. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we'll go more into what those titles mean in this Revelation study, because King of Kings and Lord of Lords is found in the book of Revelation. And all people will stand before the great white throne judgment to be judged someday. So that is another theme. And then there's the conflict of the earthly kingdoms that lead up to the final battle of Armageddon, the final doom of Satan, the final doom of the Antichrist, the false prophets, and all the enemies of God, and the future hope and a home on the new earth for all of God's people. And so then we will see the finished work of Christ. You know, we forget that in the Lord's Prayer, he prays, Lord, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. In this time period when it is fulfilled, God's kingdom will be on earth as it is in heaven. So God knows all of history. He's omniscient. He's outside of time. He's outside of space. He knows the past. He knows the present. He knows the future. And he knows everything. And that is one of the big themes that is all throughout the book of Revelation, is that God knows all of history, including the troubles that his children have to go through. But there is the promise and there's the hope that, ultimately God is sovereign. He is in complete control There's nothing that happens that he doesn't know about, and there's nothing that happens that he's surprised about and or is not prepared about. So Revelation is the only book in the Bible that contains a blessing for reading it. You can find that blessing in chapter 1, verse 3, and chapters 22, verse 7. Next, I want to talk about some of the symbolism that we can find in Revelation. The purpose of John's images in the visions and revelations are to invoke a response. Some of this stuff is really scary. We're supposed to respond to it. It's supposed to bring a response. The symbols must not be taken literally. That is a big mistake that a lot of people make, unless we have supporting evidence to interpret them literally. So sometimes John tells us what the symbols mean, and if he tells us what the symbols mean, we don't need to look any farther because that's what it means, and therefore we shouldn't assume more. John expected his first century audience to plainly understand the symbols. Therefore, we must not interpret them in a way that they would not have understood those symbols, and we're going to try to interpret them in a way that the first century church would have interpreted them. Because if they didn't understand it, then we can't understand it either, right? John uses a lot of numbers. I'm not going to really talk about the numbers right now because we're going to get to that in the Bible study itself. And then there's a lot of terms here that I'm not going to go over. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here. This is the end of the introduction, the historical background of Revelation. When we come back, we will start in chapter 1, verse 1 of Revelation. And so watch video 3. Video 3 is when we're going to start Revelation.